Week 15 is in the books, and that means that we have a whole nother week of observations and lessons that we can learn from this past week of fantasy football. So I have 4 Dynasty observations and lessons that I have learned from this past week. So let's get right into the video. So as I mentioned, I have 4 Dynasty observations that I have learned from this past week of football in week 15, 2021. So let's get right into it. Get set into first down. Because over the last 3 weeks, Amon-Ra St. Brown has been phenomenal for fantasy football and is actually the wide receiver 3 over that stretch, averaging 11.7 targets, 8.7 receptions, 83 receiving yards, and 0.7 receiving touchdowns per game in the last 3 weeks. Granted, there is a little bit of overlap there over the last 3 weeks with Amon-Ra St. Brown's success correlating with no TJ Hawkinson and no DeAndre Swift on the Detroit Lions. But this mini breakout should not go unnoticed or be underestimated, because on the season, St. Brown is still a top 40 wide receiver in fantasy, averaging only 10 fantasy points per game. But we have seen flashes of this kind of production earlier in the year with 6 for 70 in week 4, 7 for 65 in week 5. He's had flashes and situations and opportunities where he has shown that he can be a very good wide receiver in both the NFL and for fantasy football. And he's going to end the season with over 100 targets, if not closer, honestly, to 120 total targets, and then 75 to 80 receptions at his current rate right now. The issue, though, for Amon-Ra St. Brown is not the volume. It's actually just the receiving yards and receiving touchdowns. And it's going to be hard to get receiving yards when you're averaging 6.6 air yards per target. And then obviously it's going to be hard to score touchdowns when you play for the Detroit Lions. Those are just 2 things that are kind of out of Amon-Ra St. Brown's control. But at least for right now, the volume in terms of targets and receptions are phenomenal in his rookie season, and he is already looking like a very strong and consistent fantasy option for us down the road in terms of long-term success. Very similar to guys that we've seen previously in a PPR kind of sense, guys like Julian Edelman, Jarvis Landry, kind of like what we're seeing from Hunter Renfrow right now. This is kind of the path that we are seeing from Amon-Ra St. Brown. In fact, among all rookie wide receivers since 2000, Amon-Ra St. Brown is on a very strong pace that can predict future wide receiver fantasy success. So let me break this down for you. At minimum, the cutoff for future success by a rookie wide receiver is 150 fantasy points in your rookie season. Ideally, you would like to see 200 because that can really predict future elite fantasy success. But at a minimum, the baseline is 150 fantasy points. Based on all rookie wide receivers who have scored at least 150 fantasy points in their rookie year, 73% of them have gone on to be a top 24 fantasy wide receiver at some point later on in their career. That number drops hard whenever you don't hit 150 fantasy points, all the way down to 14%. And a similar situation happens when you look at top 12 seasons, with 55% of receivers over 150 points going on to have a wide receiver 1 season, and only 8% going on to have a wide receiver 1 season below 150 fantasy points. Amon-Ra St. Brown is currently on a 17-game pace on about 170 fantasy points, which will put him nicely above the 150 mark, even when you compare them to 16-game seasons in the past. His pace right now on a points per game average puts him around a lot of other rookies like DJ Moore, Jerry Jeudy, Deontay Johnson, Hunter Renfrow, and many others who did go on to either have great fantasy production or have really high value for Dynasty, that we would consider them a hit for Dynasty managers. So this gives me a lot of hope and confidence moving forward for Amon-Ra St. Brown, given the shape of the Lions and how he's performed very recently over the past few weeks, that he is well positioned for a long-term part and piece of this team over the long term, which gives me confidence in his ability to be a very solid fantasy asset for us moving on down the road. Moving on into second down, and I need to admit that I was very, 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 very wrong on Mark Andrews. Like very, very wrong, because he has had an absolutely fantastic fantasy season, and I was fading him back in August in redraft leagues. I wasn't in on his price in Dynasty. I was fading him for guys like Kyle Pitts, TJ Hawkinson, and boy, do I look like an idiot right now, because not only is Mark Andrews having a career season, but he has paced Travis Kelce as the tight end 1 or 2 basically the entire season long, and has produced elite fantasy games all season that would make a lot of wide receivers really, really jealous. And one of the reasons that I was fading Andrews was, to date in his career, I believe that he had really only seen the volume and the targets that he had gotten out of pure necessity, because on that team for Lamar to throw to, it was only Mark Andrews and Hollywood Brown. And Hollywood, up until this point as well, has not shown that he could really be a good alpha wide receiver. So it was largely out of necessity that I believe Mark Andrews was getting a lot of his fantasy production. But then whenever you throw in more players like Sammy Watkins, Rashad Bateman, I thought that target share was going to decrease for Mark Andrews, let alone the fact that he has also not ever been really a volume tight end either. He's never been the guy to receive a boatload of targets every single week, and he made a lot of his fantasy success on touchdowns and efficiency inside the red zone, which is what the Ravens in general, since Lamar Jackson has joined, have been really, really good at. This year, however, he's just obliterated all of those opinions or ideas that I had about how Mark Andrews scored fantasy points, because he has still performed as a top target on this team, even with the additions of Rashad Bateman and Sammy Watkins, like I mentioned, and still Hollywood Brown having a kind of mini breakout in the midseason of the year as well. He's become a volume tight end with already over 120 targets on the year, and he is well on his way to have over 100 receptions and between 13 to 1400 receiving yards by the end of the season. And he's done all that while maintaining his scoring efficiency, because he's on pace for yet another double-digit touchdown season. So he's been absolutely incredible all year long, and it's just basically just proved me wrong at every single step of the way. And in fact, he's been so incredible that I actually got to thinking, is Mark Andrews now in the conversation for the Dynasty tight end 1 overall crown? And I know that sounds kind of crazy. That would have sounded really crazy to me just a few months ago, but I think this is kind of a legit question now, because when you look at December DLF ADP that we have, Andrews is still only the tight end 5 behind the other big 4 names that you all know. But the arguments for him to be above a couple of guys are pretty easy to me. I mean, number one, Darren Waller. I'm actually surprised that he is below Darren Waller in December ADP, given Darren Waller's kind of poor performance all year long and Andrews' giant surge, plus the fact that Darren Waller is older than Mark Andrews himself. I think that's a pretty easy conversation for me when you consider production and age for Andrews versus Waller. Kittle has also been great over the last few weeks, but Andrews is a couple years younger and doesn't have the injury history that George Kittle has, plus the unpredictability of what Trey Lance could become. Even though we have high expectations, there is also the probability that Trey Lance is not what we expect from a quarterback, especially in a passing situation, that would drop George Kittle a little bit in terms of production, plus also the injury and the fact that George Kittle is also just a little bit older than Mark Andrews. Number 3, Travis Kelce. He's been the fantasy tight end 1 for like 6 years now in terms of production, but a down season at 32 years old, quote unquote down season at 32 years old. I always say that when 2 players score the same, give me the younger guy in Dynasty. So that situation applies here for Mark Andrews versus Travis Kelce. And then finally, we get to Kyle Pitts, who will probably never be unseated as the Dynasty tight end 1 after a historical rookie season. I know that's crazy. Kyle Pitts has been a huge disappointment for fantasy, but he is still on a historic tight end rookie season pace in terms of yards, receptions, all that other stuff. It's really just the touchdowns that have kind of foiled him up until this point. And very similar to like what I was mentioning with Amon-Ra St. Brown, you kind of can't really help it whenever you're on the Atlanta Falcons and that team in general just doesn't score a lot of touchdowns. But Kyle Pitts is basically all currently just hype, or at least the expectations and the hype of what we think Kyle Pitts can be down the road in the future. But Andrews out there winning people championships right now. He's doing it. He's winning you guys games. He's probably going to win you guys championships in Dynasty and redraft. And that production is going to win over a lot of people at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, it's production versus hype. And a lot of people are going to take that production. And I think that Mark Andrews has a legit conversation to be the tight end 1 over Kyle Pitts right now. So we'll have to see what Andrews does in 2022 whenever J.K. Dobbins comes back. Maybe the Ravens can establish a little bit more of the run game that they pride themselves on. But if this is the new ceiling that Mark Andrews has, then the sky is the limit, because he will only still be 26 years old next year and is going to be one of the youngest elite Dynasty tight ends that we have right now. And all of that baked in gives me confidence to say that he has a legit shot and argument to be the Dynasty tight end 1 overall right now. Getting set into third down, let's talk about this Green Bay Packers backfield, as both Aaron Jones and AJ Dillon are actually currently top 20 running backs on the season right now. And this backfield has basically become a split that I don't think any fantasy manager really loves, since we would like the Packers to basically choose one or the other, because a lot of people are really invested in Aaron Jones. A lot of people are really invested in AJ Dillon. We don't really like the split that we have right now. So just pick one of these guys, and that would be great for fantasy football. And it's also a weird dynamic when you remember the fact that the Packers gave Aaron Jones a big 4-year, $48 million contract before the season actually started. So why all of a sudden are they starting to give more touches to AJ Dillon after they just paid Aaron Jones a whole bunch of money? And that's really a really weird dynamic to me when you consider how this whole entire season has ended up, in that both Packers running backs are top 20 fantasy backs right now. But it's also still that contract for Aaron Jones that gives me hope that there's light at the end of the tunnel for this situation in the current backfield split, because what looks like a fantastic deal for Aaron Jones, $12 million a year, $13 million in signing bonus, is actually a very team-friendly deal for the Packers, who can cut a 29-year-old Aaron Jones at the end of the 2022 season and save $13 million in cap space after that season. So it's actually really team-friendly. They can kind of readjust and reevaluate Aaron Jones's benefits and his real stance on this team, and see where AJ Dillon is as well. So that contract gives me a lot of hope that there will be a lot of AJ Dillon in this Packers backfield very, very soon. And honestly, I think that he deserves it. He's looked great all year. He's matched Aaron Jones on the ground in the games that they both gotten receiving work as well, even though Aaron Jones has been the receiving back up till date. Whenever AJ Dillon does get the receiving work, he's been great in that facet of the game, hauling in all but 2 of his targets for 274 yards and 2 touchdowns. He's looked fantastic on both the ground and through the air. And unfortunately, Dillon's potential future makes Aaron Jones a dynasty sell. It's really unfortunate for me to say, because I was a huge Aaron Jones guy. Even back before he got drafted by the Packers, I was all in. But unfortunately, at this point in his career, with his current situation and contract, AJ Dillon coming up on the rise, I think that Aaron Jones is a dynasty sell. And the community is honestly starting to catch on as well, because in December ADP, he is ranked as the RB17, above only guys like J.K. Dobbins, David Montgomery, Josh Jacobs, a couple other guys who are just either older veterans or timeshare guys. And he's only less than 2 rounds ahead of his teammate, AJ Dillon. And looking at his ADP, I would definitely be buying AJ Dillon at his price. If I could turn ETN or Miles Sanders into AJ Dillon, I would do that in a freaking heartbeat, because I think that's a huge time win over the next couple of years. And on the flip side, back to Aaron Jones, I would definitely be selling Aaron Jones for guys like Derrick Henry, J.K. Dobbins, David Montgomery. I don't even know if you can do that anymore, but I would definitely be trying to do a 1-for-1 move off of Aaron Jones if you want to maintain kind of that production at the running back position. But I think also a really smart move for Aaron Jones would be moving down to a guy like Leonard Fournette and doing a trade of Aaron Jones for Leonard Fournette plus, because assuming that you take on the risk of Fournette's impending free agency, and then assuming that he stays in Tampa Bay, which I think is a very good bet right now, that the Buccaneers are going to re-sign Leonard Fournette after this year, then you maintain or actually potentially increase your production with Leonard Fournette in the Buccaneers backfield versus Aaron Jones, while gaining another asset on top of Leonard Fournette that could turn into something that you can either flip or actually use for production next year. So the moral of the story in this segment is sell Aaron Jones, buy AJ Dillon, profit all that money. And then finally, we move into 4th down. And as if I didn't learn anything from fading and doubting Mark Andrews, I don't know. Are we concerned about DK Metcalf? Because I'm kind of concerned about him. And I can't really explain why, but I've never really been a DK Metcalf guy. It's just really weird to me. I don't really understand his price. I've never been on board with it, which is weird because even though he's valued as the top 5 wide receiver in Dynasty, he was the wide receiver 6 last year. So why can't I wrap my head around why DK Metcalf is valued as a top 5 Dynasty wide receiver at only 24 years old? But maybe this is just me not having any DK Metcalf and not really watching Seahawks games, so I don't really see a whole lot of what Metcalf is doing. But it feels like Metcalf is just like a huge home run swing every single week, almost like he's the modern day fantasy version of mid-2000s Barry Bonds, where if you remember, like every at-bat Barry Bonds had with the Giants late in his career, it was either a strikeout or it was a 450-foot bomb into the river in San Fran. Like those were the only 2 options that Barry Bonds had. And that's what Metcalf feels like right now, because it feels like you're either going to get a game around ish or under 10 fantasy points because he has like 4 for 58, and that's fine, or you're going to get one of his double digit touchdown games where he has like 7 for 102, and then you're super happy because he caught a couple long bomb touchdowns and you helped win yourself a week with DK Metcalf. And I know that home run swing kind of worked last year. I mean, he had 9 top 25 weekly performances last year, 4 of which were inside the top 12 as wide receiver 1 weeks. And that helped him be the wide receiver 6 on the season last year. This year, though, that just hasn't fallen his way. It's actually dropped down to 5 top 24 weeks this year, 4 of those inside the top 12. But other than that, he's largely struck out. He's not been really a good fantasy option. He's not even been a wide receiver 2. He's been a wide receiver 3 or barely even a flex option for you in a lot of games this year. And to further prove my point, DK Metcalf actually has as many games with more than 6 receptions as he does under 2 receptions. Like, that's really crazy just how like consistent he is in terms of basically getting 4, 5, 6 receptions. He's not a volume guy. He's not a PPR guy. He's a home run swing every single week. He has one game over 90 yards more than he does games under 40 receiving yards. Like, it's just really weird production to me, especially whenever you consider the fact that Tyler Lockett has also been just as good, if not better, on the same team with the same quarterback, and Russell Wilson, one of the best and most efficient quarterbacks in the league. Like, I just can't wrap my head around DK Metcalf's weekly production and why he still is valued as a top 5 wide receiver as a huge home run swing every single week. Which brings me to my point that what if Russell Wilson is not there in 2022 and beyond? I'm a firm believer that Russell Wilson does stay in Seattle, but where there's smoke, there's fire. And there's some smoke coming around here that Russell Wilson will not be on this team after this year. And if that is the case, Metcalf is going to take a really hard hit for fantasy that will really lower his fantasy ceiling on a weekly basis. And then on the flip side, assuming that Russell Wilson is still a Seahawk after this year, then we're just kind of back into this type of production that we've seen over the past couple of years, where you just really are taking a dice roll on whether or not you're getting DK Metcalf 25 fantasy points or DK Metcalf 10 points, because there's really no in between. It's one or the other, and you're hoping on a weekly basis that you just got more 25 fantasy point games than you did 10 fantasy point games, and that's going to be better for you in the long run with DK Metcalf. So where does DK Metcalf rank for you guys? Like I said, I struggle to have him as a top 5 dynasty wide receiver evaluation. I would easily pivot off of him to guys like AJ Brown, Cooper Kupp, even Devontae Adams, all of whom are being taken after DK Metcalf right now. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I don't have all the facts. Maybe it's just how I like to build my rosters or how I like my wide receiver ones to score. Maybe I just need to be bought in more to DK Metcalf. I don't know. But top 5 just feels a little too rich for my blood and a price that I'm not willing to pay for DK Metcalf. So those are my 4 dynasty observations that I have learned or taken away from this past week 15 of fantasy football. And if you would like to see a more complete breakdown of the entire slate of games from this past week, you can click right up here and watch that video. And with that all being said, guys, thank you all so much for watching. We'll catch y'all later.